Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Here we are going to delve into a case that raises some serious concerns about self-defense, personal responsibility, and the escalation of violence in everyday situations. Imagine this: a heated argument in a fast food restaurant, a scuffle, and moments later a man is shot dead. But here's the twist. Did the shooter act in self-defense, or did he take justice into his own hands? On that fateful day in a Houston McDonald's, Anthony Landry found himself at odds with Jeffrey Limmer, a lawyer who had stepped in during Landry's verbal confrontation with the restaurant employees. This confrontation quickly turned physical, but the tragedy unfolded when Landry retrieved a gun from his truck and shot Limmer dead. Was Landry acting in fear for his life after being physically assaulted? Or did he escalate the situation beyond what the law allows for self-defense? In this episode, we are going to dive into the facts. We're going to explore both sides of this tragic case, and we're going to ask the ultimate question: where should the line be drawn when it comes to defending yourself with deadly force? Stick around. Let's get into it. At the core of Anthony Landry's case is a question that challenges our understanding of self-defense and the boundaries of justified force. Because when does the right to protect oneself cross the line into unlawful violence? In many ways, this is a question that strikes at the heart of a broader debate surrounding self-defense laws, particularly in states like Texas, where individuals are granted significant legal leeway to use deadly force when they believe their lives are in danger. Landry's defense maintained that he was defending himself after being physically attacked by Jeffrey Limmer. According to the defense, Landry feared for his safety after Limmer shoved him to the ground during an argument, leaving him feeling vulnerable and threatened. From their perspective, Landry's decision to retrieve a gun from his truck and then return to confront Limmer was born out of fear and a perceived need for self-preservation. But was Landry truly defending himself? Or at that point, had the danger passed by the time he returned from the truck with his gun? This is where the prosecution's case was built, as you can imagine. Was Landry still in immediate danger, or had he escalated the situation beyond what self-defense laws allow? The key question here is whether the threat posed by Limmer had already dissipated by the time Landry made the decision to re-enter the restaurant armed. In Texas, like many other states, individuals are permitted to use deadly force if they reasonably believe that their life or the lives of others are in immediate danger. We cover this a lot. But the law also emphasizes that the force must be used proportional to the threat. We've talked about that before. Had Limmer, who had already retreated into the restaurant, posed an imminent threat to Landry when he returned with that gun? Witnesses, surveillance footage, and the timeline of events paint a picture of a rapidly evolving situation, but one where the immediate threat may have already passed. That's something we don't normally run across in cases like this, where it's a question of murder versus self-defense. And that's what makes this a little bit more interesting. Landry's defense focused on the fact that Limmer had physically attacked him first. He had pushed him to the ground, which they argued left Landry feeling both physically vulnerable and emotionally triggered. They contended that this justified Landry's actions under Texas law, as he believed that further harm could come his way. However, the prosecution countered that the danger had already passed once Limmer retreated inside the McDonald's, and Landry's decision to return with a gun demonstrated a premeditated desire for retaliation rather than any self-defense. And this raises a deeper question about these boundaries of self-defense that we run into all the time. Is it reasonable to use deadly force after an initial threat has subsided, especially after there's time to pause and reflect before acting? A lot of times when people overfire a gun or stab too many times or things like this, and they say, hey, I was in the moment of my adrenaline and I was freaking out, basically. They say they're in the throes of it and they couldn't stop. But here you did have a moment. There's a moment of pause where you're doing something else, returning to an incident where maybe things have calmed down. Ultimately, the court had to decide whether Anthony Landry's use of deadly force met the legal definition of self-defense, or whether his actions amounted to murder. It's a question that invites reflection not only on the specifics of this case, but also on the broader societal implications of self-defense laws and the limits of personal responsibility. Let's take a look at the facts in this case. So the deadly confrontation between Anthony Landry and Jeffrey Limmer began inside the McDonald's. Okay, so clear it's inside, where a simple dispute over a refund spiraled into this tragic series of events. What started as a verbal altercation quickly escalated when Landry's temper flared, becoming aggressive toward the staff. Now, Limmer, an attorney and a bystander, he decides to intervene. He aims to diffuse the situation. However, instead of calming down, the interaction between Limmer and Landry become increasingly hostile instead. Surveillance footage from the restaurant and witness accounts depict how this volatile exchange unfolded. At one point, Limmer physically shoved Landry to the ground, further intensifying the tension. While the shove may have been an attempt to protect the McDonald's employees from Landry's aggressive behavior, instead, it escalated all of this to the conflict that it became, dangerous levels. At that moment, Landry had the option to leave, having already been physically overpowered. However, instead of de-escalating the situation or walking away, he leaves the restaurant and retrieves a gun from his truck. This decision would prove to be a pivotal moment in the case against him. Now, upon returning to the McDonald's parking lot, Landry did not re-enter the restaurant with any intention of peacefully resolving this dispute. Witnesses reported that Landry opened the door, immediately brandishing his gun and aiming it at Limmer, who had already gone back inside after the shove. Limmer, who was unarmed, posed no visible threat at the time. The rapid sequence of events saw Landry firing multiple shots at Limmer, hitting him in the upper body several times. Panic erupted inside the restaurant as customers and employees are scrambling for cover. Chaos ensues. Some witnesses flee through the back exits while others seek refuge behind tables and the counters. Limmer collapses to the ground. He's critically injured by the gunfire. Despite the frantic efforts of emergency responders, Limmer succumbed to his injuries before paramedics arrived, leaving the restaurant scene in horror and disbelief. Landry, meanwhile, left the McDonald's parking lot immediately after the shooting. He drove away in his truck. However, the event had been witnessed by multiple people and captured clearly on surveillance cameras. There was no mystery here about who pulled the trigger. The focus of the case was not about identifying the shooter, but rather to determine whether Landry's actions were justified. In the days that followed this tragic shooting, the Houston community was shaken. This wasn't just a case of a spontaneous altercation that ended in death. It highlighted complex questions surrounding self-defense, the use of deadly force, and whether Landry's actions fit within Texas's legal parameters for justified self-defense. Landry was arrested within days of the shooting and charged with murder. Investigators were quick to review the surveillance footage and conduct interviews with witnesses who had been present during the altercation. The timeline of events pieced together from this evidence became critical to the prosecution's case. What the footage revealed was a clear escalation After being shoved to the ground, Landry left the scene only to return armed. Prosecutors argued that this window of time showed that Landry was no longer in immediate danger by the time he retrieved his gun and confronted Limmer. The timeline they suggested undermined any argument of heat-of-the-moment self-defense, pointing instead to a more calculated decision to seek retaliation. This investigation also went into Landry's behavior leading up to the shooting. Witnesses described him as increasingly agitated as well as aggressive, using racial slurs and yelling at the McDonald's staff over a refund issue. Limmer's intervention, intended to de-escalate conflict, was the turning point, but Landry's response to being physically shoved, choosing to arm himself and return for a confrontation, was the key element under scrutiny here. From the outset, Landry's defense argued that his actions were a legitimate use of self-defense. According to his lawyer, Keith Kager, Landry was physically assaulted when Limmer shoved him to the ground, leaving him in a position where he felt his life was at risk. This fear, they argued, justified his decision to arm himself to prevent further harm. The defense leaned heavily on Texas's self-defense laws, which permit individuals to use deadly force if they believe they're in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. To bolster their case, the defense focused on the initial physical altercation. They argued that Landry's response was reasonable given that he had been attacked by Limmer. Texas law does not require individuals to retreat if they are threatened. And Landry's defense hinged on the idea that he believed he was facing continued danger even after that shove. However, a critical issue in the case was whether the level of force that Landry used was proportional to the threat he faced. The fact that Limmer had not pursued Landry into the parking lot after the initial altercation cast doubt on the defense argument. Prosecutors pointed out that by the time Landry returned with the gun, Limmer had already gone back inside the restaurant and was no longer an active threat. When people walk away from each other, that is an opportunity for the conflict to end. Both sides have a choice. Well, prosecutor Tiffany Dupree had her choice, and she took a hard stance against Landry, contending that his actions far exceeded what was permissible under Texas law. Dupree emphasized that Landry had the opportunity to leave the scene entirely, which he did after he shot the victim, but he could have done that after being shoved. But he chose to return to confront Limmer. According to the prosecution, this choice was indicative of premeditation rather than a reaction to an immediate threat. The surveillance footage became central to the prosecution's case. It showed Limmer retreating into the McDonald's after the shove, no longer actively engaging with Landry. In Dupree's view, this made it clear that Limmer no longer posed an imminent threat to Landry's life when he returned with a gun. The prosecution argued that Landry's decision to shoot Limmer multiple times was not an act of self-defense. This was retaliation. Further, the prosecution highlighted the excessive nature of the force used. Multiple gunshots were fired at Limmer, an unarmed man who had retreated from the altercation. This, they contended, was not a proportional response to being shoved. The prosecution painted Landry as a man with a volatile temper, someone who reacted to a minor altercation by taking the law into his own hands, resulting in an unnecessary and tragic death. And let's get into what we're interested in here, the public reaction. Of course, it is a divided community. That's what we discuss here. The case of Anthony Landry and Jeffrey Limmer sparked intense debate and divided the public opinion. Not just in the Houston area, though. This was across the nation. For some, Landry's actions were seen as an unfortunate but understandable reaction because he was physically attacked. In their view, Landry had been physically overpowered by Limmer, a man who was larger in size, and the shove to the ground may have left Landry fearing for his safety. Supporters argued that the situation spiraled out of control due to Limmer's intervention, which Landry could have interpreted as a physical threat. These advocates pointed to Texas's robust self-defense laws, specifically the state's Stand Your Ground statute, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they think they're in imminent danger. They believed Landry's decision to arm himself and return to the scene was justified under these laws, as he had been assaulted, and it was unclear what further threat he might face. But on the other hand, many saw Landry's actions as an overreaction and a tragic misuse of force. In their eyes, the situation could have been resolved peacefully, especially after Landry was no longer a direct threat. They argued that by the time Landry returned with a gun, Limmer had retreated and no longer posed the direct imminent threat that he says he thought he was in. This group viewed Landry's response as one that went beyond self-defense and entered into the realm of vigilantism. To them, Limmer's death was avoidable and a result of Landry choosing to escalate rather than de-escalate. The division in public opinion reflected larger national conversations around self-defense and stand your ground laws. People are very interested in this because anybody could find themselves in a unique situation where they feel like their lives are in danger. This whole topic has been the subject of debate in high-profile cases across the country. Cases like Landry's often prompt larger discussions about the limits of self-defense, particularly when the initial threat appears to have subsided. For critics of stand your ground laws, Landry's actions were emblematic of the potential dangers of such legislation, where individuals may feel emboldened to use deadly force even when it's not strictly necessary. Supporters of these laws, however, argue that they provide necessary protections for individuals who genuinely feel threatened and may not have the luxury of assessing the situation calmly while they're in their moment of panic. The courtroom drama surrounding Anthony Landry's trial unfolded with all the intensity and complexity of any high-profile case involving self-defense laws and a public shooting. Both the defense and prosecution presented compelling arguments, each leaning heavily on witness testimony and surveillance footage from the McDonalds. The central question for the jury was whether Landry's use of deadly force was justified, or was it an excessive response to a situation that had already de-escalated. It's a tough one. The defense's legal strategy was built around Texas's self-defense laws. Several key witnesses took the stand to testify that Limmer was the initial aggressor who shoved Landry to the ground. Witnesses in support of Landry's defense, well, they described him as agitated but fearful after the altercation, painting a picture of a man who felt very concerned and unsure of what Limmer was going to do next. The defense further argued that Limmer, as a larger man, had used his size and his strength to overpower Landry, making Landry's actions a justifiable attempt to protect himself. Prosecution, however, painted a starkly different picture. Tiffany Dupree, the prosecutor, she argued that Landry's decision to retrieve a gun and return to the restaurant, this was not a defensive action, but rather a calculated move to seek revenge because he had been humiliated. Dupree pointed to the surveillance footage that showed Limmer retreating into the McDonald's after the altercation, and then highlighted that Limmer posed no immediate threat to Landry when he goes out to his truck and then he returns armed. Now, in the prosecution's view, Landry's actions were premeditated and retaliatory, driven more by anger than fear. And there's a big difference here. It's also something to notice and to know that it's very difficult to know for sure what anyone's perceptions are. They're personal to each person. Key witnesses from the McDonald's staff and patrons who had been present during the incident testified that Landry's behavior was aggressive from the beginning. Several employees recalled Landry's verbal abuse and even racial slurs. that he was hurling during his argument over this refund. They also described how Limmer's intervention, while well-intentioned, quickly escalated the confrontation. Witnesses were crucial in illustrating the timeline and sequence of events, particularly in showing how Landry had ample opportunity to leave after being shoved. The testimony of forensic experts also played a critical role in the trial. Ballistic experts testified about the nature of the gunshots, noting that Landry had fired multiple rounds at Limmer, further undermining the claim that this was a spur-of-the-moment defensive action. The pattern and the placement of the shots suggested, according to the prosecution, that Landry was not acting in panic, but had instead taken deliberate aim to inflict fatal injuries. The trial's emotional intensity reached its peak when witnesses described the chaos and the panic inside the McDonald's after the shots were fired. The vivid accounts of customers and employees fleeing for their lives and the sight of Limmer collapsing from his injuries added a deeply human element to the legal arguments. These testimonies made it clear that Landry's decision to escalate the conflict had far-reaching tragic consequences. This case presented the jury with a very difficult task. On one hand, Landry's defense asked them to consider the perspective of a man who had been physically attacked. He was left fearing for his life. But then on the other hand, the prosecution pushed the narrative of a man who chose to settle a minor altercation with deadly force, crossing the line from self-defense into murder. Both sides presented strong arguments, leaving the jury to weigh the legal standards for self-defense against the specifics of Landry's actions on that fateful day. The Anthony Landry and Jeffrey Limmer case. This stirred controversy on several fronts. Central to the debate was whether Landry's actions fit the definition of self-defense, or if he escalated the situation unnecessarily. This question became the heart of the courtroom drama and the media coverage that followed. One of the primary sources of tension was the timing of the shooting. After Limmer had shoved Landry to the ground, witnesses and surveillance footage showed that the immediate physical threat seemed to have passed. Limmer retreated into the McDonald's, and many argued that Landry had the option to leave, but instead he chooses to return with a gun, and then he shoots Limmer multiple times. Was this a reasonable response to a perceived ongoing threat? Or did Landry's decision to re-engage with a firearm amount to unnecessary retaliation? This distinction became a focal point in the courtroom. Of course, Texas's stand your ground law allows individuals to use deadly force if they feel they are in imminent danger. However, prosecutors argued that by the time Landry retrieved that gun, the threat had already diminished. The prosecution's stance was that Landry's decision to return to the McDonald's with a gun indicated premeditation, not self-defense. Critics feared that this type of interpretation of self-defense laws could lead to a wider acceptance of retaliatory violence under the guise of protection. Let me ask you guys this. Would it have made a difference if he reached into his pocket to get a gun? And in the moment of rushing out into his car to grab that gun, would his thoughts have had time to change? Or was he still in defense mode, grabbing his weapon? Additionally, the case highlighted concerns about racial dynamics and violence escalation in public spaces. Witnesses reported that Landry had used racial slurs during his initial argument with the McDonald's employees, and this detail raised questions about his mindset and whether anger and bias contributed to his decision to resort to violence. The racial undertones of the argument fed into larger societal conversations about how confrontations involving individuals from different racial backgrounds can quickly spiral out of control, especially when firearms are involved. The media's portrayal of the case, well, this also added to the controversy. News outlets focused heavily on the surveillance footage and the aggressive language that was used by Landry. The language he used and what people heard painted him in a negative light. But he did have his supporters, and they argued that the media's focus on those aspects, they were overshadowing his legitimate fear for his safety, especially after the physical altercation with Limmer, a bigger man. In the end, this case left many divided. Where should that line be drawn when it comes to self-defense? Did Landry have the right to protect himself? Or did he take the law into his own hands in a way that was disproportionate to the threat he faced? When you are in that adrenaline throw, what is reasonable in an expectation for someone to be able to calm down and make a rational choice? Could he have done that when he was out at the truck? Was he too riled up for that to happen? Could that happen to any of us? When we get riled up and we're trying to get something done, maybe defending our lives, you're focused on your defense. And that's where this gets tricky, because we don't know what was going on in his mind. And so you can only take what you've heard, what was presented in the courts, for a choice. And that's exactly where we're going to turn this over to you right now. Because now that we have gone over the facts and the arguments, the points of controversy, where do you stand? Was Landry justified in believing that his life was in danger after he was shoved to the ground by Limmer, even though the physical threat had seemingly ended? Or did Landry's decision to return to the restaurant with a gun cross the line into unjustified retaliation? And when he's in that throw, when anyone is trying to defend themselves, their first decision is to defend themselves. And so in order to make any other decisions, you need a moment to be able to think. And did Landry have enough of that moment to change his mind and just leave, stay in his truck, stay safe? Texas's self-defense laws permit the use of deadly force when a person believes their life is in danger. But there's still the question of whether Landry had that reasonable fear for his safety in that moment he pulled the trigger. Did he have time to change his mind? Does anyone? How does that work? Did he still truly fear for his life in that moment that he went back into the McDonald's and shot this man multiple times? Or was he just angry after being humiliated in front of others and then it happened to him? As always, I'm leaving this up to you, the listeners, to decide. Was this a clear case of self-defense under Texas law? Or did Anthony Landry take justice into his own hands in a way that was not legally or morally justified? What do you think? Can you even make a choice and be committed 100%? Think about the jury. Thank you for joining me on True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay curious, stay aware. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.